a lot of aspects define what your culture is. It's not, I think, the values on the wall. Everybody loves that, but it's the daily life. It's how the office looks. It's how you treat other people. It's what you say and how often you say it. It's how you make decisions. It's what happens behind closed doors and what is in public. It's about who you hire, who you promote, who you don't promote.
Hello and welcome to the new Emerge Product Market Fit Academy series, where we're joined by leading operators and founders in EdTech to share practical insights and advice for early stage founders. If you're building the future of learning and work, then this is for you. I'm Zara, and our guest today is Dr. Sievert Weiss. Sievert studied medicine in Germany, Portugal, and Brazil, and earned his doctorate in molecular biology. In 2012, after graduation, he co-founded Amboss, a medical learning platform which has fundamentally changed the way medical knowledge is acquired and utilized at point of care. They have offices in New York, Berlin, and Cologne, and their international team has grown to over 400 physicians, scientists, and software engineers. Today, more than 2 million healthcare professionals in over 180 countries rely on Amboss. Sievert is also involved in multiple edtech startups and is an angel investor in companies like Junto, a digital-first cohort-based leadership training powered by world-class operators, Almio, sleep and mindfulness audio content for children, and MyReha, the first digital neuroclinic. Thank you so much, Sievert, for joining us today. I'd love to kick us off with your journey as a founder. Could you tell us a bit more about how Amboss first came about? Did you know you wanted to be a founder, or was your initial plan to be a doctor or a scientist?
Thank you, Zara, for having me in this session. So I actually never wanted to be a founder. This came all basically by coincidence. We were studying in a small study group for our final exam in med school. And we found out that the preparation for this final exam was really cumbersome, inefficient, and disgraceful, if you will. And that was already in 2010. The digital tools existed and it could have been much better. We had a mode of basically teaching each other the most important things. At some point, we were like, hey, why doesn't this exist in a digital tool that is accessible to everyone who is preparing for this final exam? And this is what started the discussion about how this could be done differently. And roughly half a year after successfully graduating from med school, we sparked this discussion and said, okay, so isn't this maybe a thing that we could try? And if we don't try today, then we will all go into the hospitals and work there for years and never come out again. So we set ourselves a timeline. I think it was 2 years at the time, and said we can dedicate 2 years to this. It's not too long. We're still young. We still have the lifestyle of students. So we can maybe afford to invest 2 years into this. And the minimum we will have gained is a lot of experience. So let's do this and see how far we get with it. That was the initial kind of moment when it all started. Obviously, there was a lot of work afterwards. And now, more than 10 years later, there has been a lot of work going into this, but that was the beginning, the early days of Ambos.
Thanks for sharing that, Sievert. What a great backstory. Now let's move on to the core part of the conversation. We're going to cover 5 topics today: key traits of successful founders, continual improvement and incentivizing feedback loops, finding and picking a co-founder, developing and maintaining a company culture, and approaching performance management. So to kick us off, let's start with founder traits. You've been in this game for a long time as a founder yourself. You've known and worked with many successful founders. How do you think about the key traits of successful founders, particularly in the field of education?
For me, it's very important to say, as like the first message here, there's a lot of talk about key traits in founders, but I don't think there's like this one founder personality. And I think you can come with a variety of backgrounds and personality traits into this game of being an entrepreneur and still be very successful. And the founders that I know are all very different and they have very different traits. So I would not, I think the least that I would want is that people feel limited by some descriptions of key traits of founders and not consider being a founder themselves. I do think there are some character traits that are helpful for being a founder, but those are also things I think that you can learn along the way. I do think for getting started, what is helpful is a bias to action. So you need to get going. Yeah. And if you don't make the first move, then nothing will happen. That's important. I do think it helps if you have a certain level of optimism, or if you want to be more blunt about it, even naivety about what you're going to do, because it'll be a long journey, but it's important to see light at the end of the tunnel and be optimistic about what you can achieve. And then I think over time, it'll be more and more about perseverance, because it won't happen that fast. And there will be highs and lows along the way, a lot of them. And there will be a couple of near death experiences and on a company level. So these three, I think, help with starting and continuing. And I might add for EdTech that, at least from what I've seen mostly with Amboss, attention to detail is super important. So to create something that is relevant in the field of EdTech and medicine in our case, it has to be to the point of what people need. And so that cannot be done with some kind of generic response. You really need to care about the content and the students and the environment that they're in, etc. Then one other thing, which is definitely true for starting, but also for continuing, which is the regret minimization framework. So will I regret not doing this when I'm 80 years old? And if the answer is yes, then you should go for it. I think this holds true both for the entire entrepreneurial journey, but also for decisions that you have to take within.
So bias to action, level of optimism, perseverance, attention to detail, and then the regret minimization framework. And from what you've said, it seems that you value these learned rather than inherent traits in founders. A lot of that requires this effort to continually improve as a founder, particularly on these traits that you've mentioned. What's your approach to continual improvement?
In the end, I think it's about basically a growth mindset. So you need to be willing to learn continuously. Like, that's the first thing. If you think you know everything, then you might not be open to any other perspectives. So I do read a lot. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I talk to other people and I discuss things with them. And basically, I try to treat as many of my encounters as learning opportunities, because I do think that basically I can learn something from anyone. That helps a lot. And then for some of those things, I think you need to allot specific time slots, be it in your calendar or wherever. For reading, I do book reading in my vacations a lot. I put specific calendar slots, articles in my weekly calendar. And I do listening to podcasts when I exercise or run. Yeah. So you have to be intentional about having reminders or dedicated time slots for things like this.
Absolutely. Intentionality is key. And often as a founder, you're busy with so many different things that if you don't make time for self-improvement in your calendar, the time just disappears. There seems to be an undercurrent of this self-awareness of where you are, where you can improve, and actively making time. It seems that self-awareness is a very important founder trait, but this requires a very strong understanding of your strengths and weaknesses. And a good way to get that is through constant feedback. So I was wondering how you encourage a strong feedback culture within Amboss, where you and your team can feel comfortable both giving and receiving feedback.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think giving and receiving feedback in the end essentially comes down to trust. So you need to create an environment of trust. There's a variety of components to trust, and you can, for example, read up on this in Speed of Trust, a book that is very helpful there. I think overall, it comes down to honestly caring about people. So you need to be authentic. You need to do what you say. You need to have people's back. You need to encourage feedback for yourself. And like, it's a level of authenticity and integrity that you want to create as your company that then allows for, I think, a safe environment. So people need to feel safe in your company to be open to voice feedback or criticism or whatever. And that will not come by itself. So basically, you have to be, as a founder, the first to live by example and demonstrate that behavior.
How do you balance creating a sense of authenticity and trust and leading by example, and also having a structured approach to giving and receiving feedback, perhaps implementing it in weekly meetings, monthly, quarterly?
There are always certain standardized feedback cadences for yearly performance review, etc. But it's more about like the culture of being very direct with your feedback, and direct in the sense of time bound to whatever the incident that happened. So let's say there is like a certain presentation of someone from your team and you didn't like it for these and those reasons, or it could have been better for certain reasons, then immediately basically provide that feedback, and not in the meeting itself in front of 20 other people, but like after the meeting, talk to that person and provide that feedback so that it does not come as a surprise at some point in your yearly feedback review. And on the other side, that this person has a chance to develop. This is well described, for example, in Radical Candor, where this means caring. You're caring about someone who you want to do a better job in the presentation next time, or someone is basically underselling her value because of not presenting in the right way. And it's actually a culture. So it's something that lives between the interactions and not so much in structured cadences.
I love that. It's what lives in between those interactions that sets up the whole culture and your approach to radical candor. I'm interested, last question on this, how your approach to feedback has evolved as the Amboss team has grown. Because as you touched on earlier, people respond very differently to different types of feedback. Radical candor is the preferred way of giving and getting feedback for some people, and for others, it terrifies them. How have you approached that as the Amboss team has scaled and you have people from many different backgrounds who approach and view feedback in different ways?
Yeah, good question. Obviously, it cannot be you anymore if you've grown to 400 or 200 or how many people you have on your team. But basically, I think what you are looking for are people that can replicate those behaviors. Not to say that they are exactly as you are, not identical to you, but like you want this kind of culture to happen across the board. I think that's, again, what you should be demonstrating, and then what you should be looking for in other people, or even making it explicit and say, hey, radical candor is something that we value at our company. So to all my people managers out there, this is what I would like you to embrace. I think this is overall with scaling, what you're looking for is like, how can I amplify the things that are important to me with my levels of leadership underneath? And you cannot guarantee that all of this will be done in the same way or identical to what you would have done, but you can make certain behaviors and certain ideas very present in all of your managers or in your entire org even.
So clearly communicating your values across the team with new members that you bring in. On that topic, would love to move over to the co-founder side. For many people, they look for co-founders with complementary skill sets, but the same core values. Would love to know how you approach finding and picking a co-founder.
In Amboss' case, it wasn't so intentional. We basically just happened to be a group of friends that encountered this opportunity. I don't know if today I would do it a lot differently, to be honest. What we could have been better with, though, and this is something we realize to the full amount only today, is that each of us has strengths and weaknesses, and they're not the same. And we could leverage those more and more in a complementary way and understand better, okay, so what does this mean for our setup? Who is doing what and who is great at what? How can we make this person be thriving more in an area that fits to their skill set? This, I would say, we have not done from the get-go. It's rather something that has developed more lately. And I think what is important, if you think about your co-founders, from my experience, is you really need to want to spend the next 5 to 10 years with this person. Not only in good times when your startup succeeds and raises one round after the next, but there will be lows as well. And it's more like a marriage than anything is. And it's maybe not just complementary skill sets. It's about spending time with each other and being able to resolve conflicts and communicating clearly with one another and those kinds of things. I don't think it's just a plain skill set kind of analysis.
That's a great point and a very interesting perspective in a world where there are a lot of people trying to over-engineer the co-founder fit as well. And there's been a lot of debate over how long you should know a co-founder for, what the relationship should be beforehand. There's been a lot of debate over, for example, entrepreneur first model. Starting a company with someone that you didn't know before was considered absolutely crazy when they started out. And yet entrepreneur first has still seen a lot of successes with that model. What do you think about that for founders starting out today? What's your advice to them on when they find that co-founder? Obviously, you touched on a few points, for example, with resolving conflict. But if you had to boil it down to, let's say, 3 key points for pinpointing who you want to build something with for the next 5 to 10 years, as you put it, like a marriage, what are the key things that people often miss out on or don't look for because they're too busy over-engineering?
That's a very good question. I would say, again, trust would be crucial. So is this a person I feel I could, if I don't have it yet, develop like a very deep trust? And if that trust is given, what you can develop is like a certain way of communicating with each other, which needs to be very honest and authentic. And be it whatever problem it is, there's no hidden information. There's no personal agenda. You can discuss things on a very clear and open platform, so to say, because then you can resolve a lot of conflict. But if the communication itself is somewhat broken or is not happening in a trustworthy setup, it'll be very hard to overcome any kind of hurdle. So I think embracing that openness and understanding where your potential co-founder or actual co-founder is coming from, and if you feel we're really talking here about the important things and we're understanding where the other person is coming from, I think that will help. And a certain way of communicating, which is like non-violent, where if you tell me this makes me feel like angry or sad or this and that, and I would wish for this way of talking to me, that all helps, I think.
So getting communication right, clear communication with each other is key for when conflict arises later on, being able to communicate that in a calm manner where you understand what you expect from each other. Conflict management is a very difficult topic for many people, particularly when you're working with someone that operates in a different way to you. You've touched on the nonviolent communication framework. It's one that many people have heard in the frame of relationships. Would love to understand how you've applied this in a work environment, because I think that's fantastic. And a lot of conflict arises for the same reasons that it does in relationships. Would love to dig into this framework in particular, because conflict management is really challenging. What are your thoughts on this? Or how have you seen conflict management done successfully for people coming from very different perspectives or different approaches to conflict?
First of all, understanding that conflict is part of your job as a founder and as a manager of the company is helpful. As human beings, I think we have the tendency to avoid conflict, right? When there's no conflict, we feel better. We try to not have conflict. And I think in the company setting, it's not that you want to have conflict, but there are always things that can be addressed. You should be addressing this conflict as early as possible. And you should also encourage your managers to do so. It might feel uncomfortable in the moment, but there's no other way. And if you keep dragging on the problem, then things will only get worse. It's like very comparable to any other kind of relationship that we have. And so similar rules apply. And in that setting, I think some of them might be prone for using nonviolent communications. As humans, we often start confrontative discussions with statements that assume something that someone else has done, etc., where you get into the mode of attacking another person, and then the other person starts basically defending themselves, and that creates a downward spiral that where you might not be able to really talk about the problem at hand so much. In nonviolent communication, as I understood it, what you do is basically talk about yourself in that problem setting where you reflect and mirror what this problem that you've identified is doing to you, and you describe your emotions and you describe your wish, how things could be different instead of basically doing the next insight. I think it's just a crucial component in some of the interactions that you will have as a manager or founder. And that might not apply to all of the situations in which you have to manage conflict. There might be very different cases where the conflict is pretty clear and you have to, I don't know, let someone go that will be hurting. But then there are other techniques that you can use at that point in time.
Another topic that I wanted to cover, being on the same page as your co-founder is so important to build trust and subsequently a strong company culture. Are there any frameworks that you follow for developing and maintaining that company culture as you scale, and especially in such a mission-driven sector like EdTech?
When you start scaling, latest, then it makes sense to become aware of what you think your culture is and what the things are that you want to maintain even with scaling. So ideally, you are, again, intentional about your culture. There are ultimately a lot of aspects that define what your culture is. And it's not, I think, the values on the wall. Everybody loves that, but it's the daily life. It's how the office looks. It's how you treat other people. It's what you say and how often you say it. It's how you make decisions. It's what happens behind closed doors and what is in public. It's about who you hire, who you promote, who you don't promote. It's what you fight for at all costs, what corners you cut, how you come to meetings, how you behave in meetings. So all of that is culture and more. And so I think you want to be very intentional about it. And ideally, as the founder or manager or management team, you want to make sure that you are an example for that culture and that your managers are amplifiers for that culture that you wish for. I think you cannot, how do you say, you cannot preach wine and then serve water. So you really be sure that everything that you say, what is important to you, it will be seen. And if there is a mismatch between what you say and how you behave, then that will be seen as well. Just become very conscious, aware, and then intentional about what you want and what you don't want. And that continues to be the same, just more difficult when you scale.
Definitely. What are the core components of the Amboss culture?
If you were to come to the Amboss office, one of them is that this is a space and place where it feels a lot like kind of like a family. The office space looks like your living room a bit, which has always been the case because that we want people to feel at home here and not have a very officey vibe. That's one kind of very, let's say, obvious thing. Another thing which is, I think, very important for us is humility in people. We have a lot of talent here at Amboss that had the highest grades in school and the best degrees from universities in med school, etc. But usually they are very down to earth, and at least the people that thrive within Amboss are very down to earth and still delivering and performing quite well. Very often they don't put themselves in the foreground, but rather, like make their team and an entire environment thrive. One of our taglines is we're humble team players. And I mean, everyone could say this, but I think this is definitely something that is an aspect that is lived through in a company. And then I think what is very important for us that a lot of edtechs share probably is impact. So like people here really care about the impact that they are making. And 1/3 of the company are physicians that always wanted to make an impact on people's lives. And I think this is a very predominant aspect here in the company culture. We do care about what we do for the patient in the end. And there are patients' lives, so to say, on the line here. We're basically all united in this. So this is infecting the entire company, that it's about the good that we create in the world and that unites us.
So we talked about the culture and mission. We've just touched on how they often act as incentives for top talent to join and stay with a startup. To get more granular on the topic of incentives, can you share your approach to performance management?
I think performance management sometimes sounds rather bad. It doesn't necessarily have a very positive connotation. But I'm deeply convinced that performance management is actually a very good thing. In the end, it's about being clear on what is expected from someone. That's super helpful if you know what that is, right? Start the discussion about where someone stands now and how they get to fulfilling the expectations. That might, again, have personal development, professional development, also reaching certain goals, etc. But after all, I think it's in everyone's interest to have that discussion, although it might be uncomfortable at times. You want to have that discussion, and you want to probably have it on an ongoing basis and not just on a yearly basis, but rather quarterly or so, that everyone is always aware of where they stand and what is expected. Promotions are no exception here, be it that you talk about someone becomes a senior or a team lead or gets a salary raise. This should all follow this process of being in discussion with your reports about where they stand, where they could develop to, and how that could happen. If this is something that is very present in your company, then this should also work for hiring external talent on almost any level, where you say, this is what you bring, this is your past or your previous experience. But hey, here is if you enter our company, here's what we will do with you to set you up for success. And we're really honestly and deeply interested in setting you up for success. Now, sometimes it might not work, and we will be honest about it, but ultimately, this is what we would wish for. We try a lot to make that happen. I think that can be a very attractive proposal.
So again, it comes down to that really clear communication. So both for internal and external stakeholders, there's no surprises later on down the road. Let's move into the last part of the session, our quick fire round. I'm going to ask you a quick question and you hit me with a one-line response. If you could have 10,000 hours retroactively invested into any specific skill, what skill would you choose?
There are so many things. I wish I could split these 10,000 hours. Swimming, as it would be very healthy. Software engineering, and being more aware of raising children properly. You do it intuitively, and maybe that's good, but I wish I knew more about it.
What do you know now that you wish you'd known when you started Amboss back in 2012?
Knowing that it'll be okay would have saved a lot of sleepless nights.
What's one of your favorite edtech startups and why?
I don't think this counts as a startup, but I was really intrigued when I first saw Wikipedia, that you could have it on your phone on the go, before there were real smartphones. And it was incredible at the time to see all of that knowledge. I just love that all of this is open to the public.
Last one, what's the next big thing in education that needs to exist?
I would wish for real educational equity in more geographies of the world. There are so many areas that are completely disconnected from the rest of the world, where there are no primary schools and not even proper sanitation, etc., but where we could start very basic and it could have enormous impacts.
Thank you so much, Sievert. It's been a real pleasure having you join us today.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Emerge Product Market Fit Academy. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it, follow our channel, and if you're feeling generous, share it with a friend.